Hi everybody, you're listening to Comics and History, episode number 124, part 6, Spotlight on the Spectre during the Ostrander-Mandrake run. And welcome to the show. I am your host, Brian J. Rygate, and class is back in session as we continue our look at the Spectre during the seminal run put together by John Ostrander and Tom Mandrake. In the latter minutes of part 5 of this episode, I began talking about a very long story arc which Mr. Ostrander and Mandrake put together. It was titled The Haunting of America. As I mentioned on part 5, it was a long, epic story which took over a year to tell, and one of the ideas behind the story was that Jim Corrigan and the Spectre had reached a balance, and now it was time to put the Spectre into play in this long-form story in which adding to the character's post-crisis history wasn't the primary focus. It was seeing the character free of any issues with regards to imbalance, going out there, facing a pretty significant enemy, and in the process helping to bring about the birth of a new hero who I don't think has been seen anywhere else in DC Comics since this run. As I'll argue near the end of episode 124, I think that a number of writers in the ensuing years have looked at the Ostrander-Mandrake run and said, this is a pretty special run. And so, out of respect for the work that Ostrander-Mandrake put in, certain toys that they created are being kept in the proverbial toy box. But if anybody knows of anywhere else in which the Patriot appeared in DC Comics, please give me a shout at comicsandhistory@gmail.com. Now, I mentioned that there were still three interesting points of character development for the Spectre. Not quite on the same level as what we saw in previous story arcs that I've talked about here on the show. But the first point was that we learned that Jim Corrigan was born in 1903. So just tightening down Jim Corrigan's personal history a little bit more. And the second point was that Jim Corrigan was very much a product of the time in which he grew up and came of age, and that he was quite homophobic. And I think it was quite brave of Mr. Ostrander to make use of a word which in the British vernacular is used to refer to cigarettes, but carries a much more offensive and derogatory connotation in regards to members of the LGBTQ community. And yes, that particular issue was written a good 20 years ago, and perhaps the 90s wasn't as sensitive a time as it is now. I know when I was going to school and when my brother was going to school, we used to throw that word around on the playground without really knowing what it meant. And certainly we felt bad about it years later when we finally woke up and realized that, hey, this was a pretty hateful term. But still, that wasn't a word which wasn't being bandied about in comics, even 20 or 30 years ago. And from looking at the responses from readers and letters pages, nobody felt that Ostrander was using that word in a hurtful way. Rather, he was using it to show just how much a product of the times Jim Corrigan was. And even though he had been walking the earth for over 50 years, there were elements of his personality which were burned into his very soul and which would not change even after 500 or 5,000 years worth of time. I'm sure that editors Dan Raspler and Pete Tomasi spoke with Ostrander first and gave their blessing for him to use that particular word. I just want to bring that up because I remember rereading that issue just recently for the show and still being amazed that that word was used not once but twice in that issue. Now, the third important point of development for the Spectre's character came during the rather obligatory tie-in to the Final Night event. That was the DC event in which the Sun Eater entered our solar system and consumed all of the sun's energy, leaving it basically a husk, and which resulted in great climate change, environmental disasters for the Earth. And so it was during this time that the Spectre had to excuse himself from the main goings-on in the Haunting of America story arc and go to the center of the Earth to find out what could be done. And it was there that the Spectre encountered Gaia, the spirit of the Earth. And of course, because the sun had been extinguished, that was creating all sorts of environmental chaos. Gaia appeared in a decaying, withering form, and she appealed to the Spectre to use his energy to help keep her warm until such time that something miraculous, i.e. Hal Jordan, would happen to restore the sun. And it was very much like what Madame Xanadu wanted when she took the power of the Spectre way back in the first story arc of the series. Madame Xanadu had wanted to take the power of the Spectre in order to heal the Earth. And here, after listening to Gaia's appeal, the Spectre apologized and said, "My power cannot be used to heal you. My power is used for vengeance." But Gaia persevered and said to the Spectre, "Just think about a time when you were happy, and that will be enough for you to keep me warm." And really great writing and art on the part of both Mr. Ostrander-Mandrake, as the Spectre accesses one of Jim Corrigan's childhood memories. And it's a beautiful summer day when Jim and his half-brother, Rafe, are swimming in the lake, and they're both happy. And we get this really nice close-up of the Spectre, and he still has his hood casting that dark shadow over top of his face, but he's smiling, and he says, "I remember, I was warm." And there's something heartwarming about it. There's nothing cheesy about the Spectre smiling, yet at the same time, it's actually quite scary to see the Spectre smiling. But Guy is successful in influencing the Spectre to use his power to warm her until such time that Hal Jordan, who at that time was Parallax, made the ultimate sacrifice and released all of the energy he had absorbed during the events of Emerald Twilight and Zero Hour to reignite the sun. And just looking at that artwork where Spectre looks out into the cosmos and sees Hal/Parallax making that sacrifice, one of the greatest tragedies is that Tom Mandrake was not a regular penciler artist on a Green Lantern series, because holy cow, did he ever draw a great Hal Jordan. It would have been great to see him drawing Hal without the white hair at the temples, wearing the classic Green Lantern costume. But still, given the historical connection between the Spectre and Hal, nice to see here that Mandrake got to draw Hal for at least 3 panels. So with the sun restored and Earth coming back into balance, the Spectre is able to return and take on the national interest. And it's near the end of the story arc where he actually gets punctured again by the Spear of Destiny. The Spear of Destiny had been found in space and used by a member of the national interest who was using a cloned version of the Sorcerer's suit of armor. And now, as part of this story arc, the actual Sorcerer's real suit of armor would be used as the vessel to house the Gestalt, which was created from the souls of a number of Americans from various cultural and gender backgrounds to represent the new and, one would say, more accurate American mythology. So the Patriot, in the end, was able to help the Spectre in taking down the national interest, but the real fear was what was going to happen to the Spectre. That certainly had a lot of fans thinking back to last days of Justice Society of America, wherein the Spectre very nearly died from being punctured by the Spear of Destiny, and it certainly unleashed a lot of temporal damage in its wake. Well, here, Nate comes onto the scene, approaches the Spectre, and says, "What's going on?" And the Spectre explains that he is in a greatly weakened state. On top of being punctured by the Spear of Destiny, he actually did deplete himself somewhat by helping to keep Gaia warm during the final night. And so the Spectre explains that there was a time when he resided in a human body, and that was for the purpose of helping him to recover his energy. And it looks like he's going to need another human body again, not just a soul, but an actual body to rest in. And the question is, in the post-crisis timeline, what exactly was the Spectre referring to? Was this an attempt to tie in an element of the Silver Age history of the Spectre, in which the Spectre was able to jump in and return to Jim Corrigan's fully human body? Of course, that part of the history had been tweaked by Ostrander and Mandrake earlier during their run. I'm thinking this was more a reference to the Doug Munch run, in which, at the time, the Spectre thought that he was entering and exiting the fully human body of Jim Corrigan. In any event, the Spectre says, well, I did this once before, but I cannot ask another person to do this for me again. I'm kind of wondering if it was the Spectre going, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, Nate, would you help me out here? And of course, Nate says, well, you can use me as your vessel for recovery. And the Spectre warns Nate. He says, well, it's dangerous for you. You will be exposed to certain horrors if you agree to be this body that I can take temporary refuge in. And Nate, being the honest and good cop, says, well, Jim Corrigan is my partner. I'm going to do this. And so we get this neat temporary change in the status quo, so to speak, as now Jim Corrigan and the Spectre